So, yeah, just starting the discussion. So, I'll give you a little history in a minute, but I teach entrepreneurship and have for about the last 6 years or so in different steads. One of which was a program in Austria, and we don't teach. I'll show you the different methodologies in a minute, but we typically don't use simulation as a modality for teaching entrepreneurship. I was asked to pull one in Austria, and Europe, simulation in the academic world is actually pretty popular. So I was asked to teach a class and run simulation for entrepreneurship. And after the first year, I gave it a shot. Wasn't necessarily the most successful thing ever. So I looked around the world and did a lot of internet searches and ran across Engage Innovate at the time and contacted Chris via just a little contact form on the link, and surprise, surprise, he called me back. Long story short, we ended up running a full-blown 3-day simulation course in Austria, and I've been a super big fan of strategy tools ever since. We still don't use simulations here in the US as a modality, but I'm going to talk about what we do use currently and how we engage students across the board, and how things are trending towards more of a simulation environment, and some of the tools that are coming out of strategy tools, I think over the year 2021 are going to be super exciting. Before I get started, can I just have sort of a quick indication? Who is currently teaching an entrepreneurship course? Anybody? No? All right. So I'm gonna run this from
I'm teaching, Rick. I'm teaching one here in Costa Rica.
Are you? Okay. At what level? Undergraduate, graduate?
Master.
Masters. Okay, good.
I'm going to be
Actually,
giving one at on on a topic at London Business School in the future, and I've given guest lectures, but not done much before.
Okay. I'm gonna give you the curriculum for a full-blown semester oriented, or could be quarter oriented course, typically 10 to 15 weeks in duration, and I'll show you longer and shorter versions of that as we go as well. So we'll start on that. A little bit of background for me. So born and raised in Silicon Valley. I'm trained as an engineer, and you'll see a lot of sort of the engineer in me when we go out and talk about entrepreneurship. So it's a little less about philosophy and history and things along those lines. It's a lot of nuts and bolts. So I currently teach out of UC Berkeley in the School of Engineering there. I went back and got an MBA, Berkeley, Columbia, so I do have background in large corporate finance, M&A, things along those lines. My professional career was in the semiconductor industry. You wouldn't recognize those names, but each of them is sort of a seminal company in the development of customized chips. You're hearing a lot of companies now developing their own microprocessors. LSI Logic, I was in charge of the first ever customizable microprocessor project. The MIPS processor ended up being the core of the original Sony PlayStation. Then I became VP of marketing at C-Cube. We were running digital video projects. So we were the first ones to put digital compression algorithms into chip form, made DVDs, digital broadcast satellite, digital cable possible. Spent a lot of time on Wall Street explaining how that works. And then VectorLink at Road was a company where we took GPS technology, put it next to a cellular radio, threw it in the trunk of a car, and we were the first ones to ever track vehicles over the internet. So all the things that you're doing today via Google Maps and whatnot, we basically invented. So I was able to participate in that. And so you'll see, again, a lot of the innovation, early stage development sort of as a thread all the way throughout these courses. I was a VC for a while, was part of the group that did early investment in Netflix and TiVo and Juniper Networks, among others. I've worked for governments. I currently have about 20 contracts for various governments around the world, and I currently teach. That's me. So entrepreneurship is interesting. So first off, let me separate entrepreneurship from innovation. So innovation / strategy, a lot of the things that you're seeing here as part of what Strategy Tools does is extremely important. And entrepreneurship, or I'm sorry, innovation has its own set of curriculum. A lot of it is centered on the great teachings of Drucker and Christensen and McGrath and others. Entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship basically is how to do a startup, how to start something from scratch, and to do so either as an independent entity like a classic Silicon Valley startup, or to do something within a larger corporation. And so there's over time been various methodologies on how to teach entrepreneurship. Classically, it's been lectures. Classically, within a university environment, the people that are qualified to teach have a PhD, have worked their way up through the academic ladder, have a whole set of lectures and series of textbooks that they've developed, and are teaching in what I would call the classic methodology. And that's all well and good, but if you think about it, many of these professors that have been involved have never done a startup and never been involved in growing a company, haven't necessarily been there, done that. And it is difficult to translate the lack of experience into the classroom and then impart that knowledge on individual students. So there's, I'd say 80% of what goes on within universities is lectures, textbooks, combined maybe with case studies. A lot of the case studies that are being used are super old school. So I know people that are teaching Alfred Sloan and GM and Henry Ford and early stage IBM. And then they're going through the development of a Ford Motor Company and talking about the Marshall Plan after World War II. And oh my God, all these case studies drives me crazy. Then the classic case studies are all Apple, early Apple, and Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs in the 1980s. No one cares. Students don't care at all. And so the stuff falls pretty flat. So I would say at this point, anybody that's doing progressive entrepreneurship teaching is not doing lectures, is not using a textbook. I don't have a textbook for my courses. We're not using case studies. I do use guest speakers. Guest speakers and case studies are interesting. There's a whole series of case studies that are coming out now that are kind of the modern, mobility, late stage internet kind of case studies. And if you have a case study that combines with a guest speaker, so we'll teach the case, have them read it, and then bring the person that was actually featured as part of the case into the classroom. That's super interesting. But what I'm going to talk about here is experiential learning. Experiential learning is basically learn by doing. So that is the ability to throw somebody into the deep end of the pool, have them go ahead and build a startup from scratch. And you do that from start to finish over some fixed period of time. And it can be as little as a week. It can be 3 weeks. I'll show you a course of 3 weeks in duration, but typically it's a semester, and a semester is long enough. A semester here is 12 to 15 weeks, depending on the school, that gives everybody a good sense of exactly how things roll out. And you have enough touch points throughout that time to go ahead and do things. So it all starts off with entrepreneurship as a journey through the fog. The journey through the fog, because as an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily know what problem it is you're solving. You don't necessarily know what solution you're going off and building. You don't know necessarily who your customers are. How are you going to build your product, what your pricing strategies are, what your go-to-market strategies are. So you're spending your time trying to figure out all of these mysteries that are thrown in front of you. So you can, like here, I love this picture because you can kind of see how things are progressing, but you don't necessarily know the direction it's going to take. We were fortunate to teach in Silicon Valley because we have a lot of lessons around us. And entrepreneurship didn't necessarily start off as a discipline. Classic startups start in garages. The myth is they start in garages and they start in coffee shops, and it actually here is true. So HP Garage is the famous garage 1930s where Hewlett and Packard got together and kind of started early stage Silicon Valley and the microwave revolution and all the electronic gear that went into radars and stuff in World War II and beyond. That garage is still there. That I took that picture. It is a national monument, and people wander around all the time and just sort of take homage at the garage itself. About 10 kilometers away, that's Steve Jobs standing in front of his house where he grew up in Los Altos, not too far from here. And a lot of the kids here went to the same high school as he did and so on. So that's the garage where the early Apple stuff was built. Google started in a garage. That's Larry Page's mom. This is a nice one because there's a couch in there. So how do you teach this methodology? How do you teach the students with trying to figure out how to take this innovative entrepreneurship style and get going? There's been a lot of attempts to try to teach this and try to systematize innovation in general. And a lot of this stuff happened right after the dot-com bust. Dot-com 2000, everything here crashed. There was a big nuclear winter, no startups, no funding. Everybody thought Silicon Valley was going to die. But slowly, 2004, 2005, 2006, we started to see incubators and accelerators and startup camps and boot camps and hackathons and pitching funds and meetups and university trips and angel groups and mentors. None of this really existed as little as 15 years ago. So all of these tools that are out there to try to teach both innovation and entrepreneurship are really, really, really new. And each one of these has been its own little experiment where people try to do things and they fail, or try to do things and they see them succeed, or try to do things and they morph and they move around. So the teaching entrepreneurship is still the same way. So everything I'm going to show you is a current point in the experiment flow. So again, none of this stuff existed 15 years ago. I'll give you one example. Hackathons. I heard a couple of people talk about hackathons already this morning. It was all the rage. A hackathon, for those of you who haven't heard the term, is basically you set up a challenge like, we're going to hack around climate change. And you put a call out to entrepreneurs. They all get together. It might be a few dozen, it might be a few hundred, it might be 1,000. And they work typically over a weekend and try to come up with things around the theme, climate change. There's some judges that take a look at how well they met the goals of the theme, and prizes are awarded. Huge thing, big deal, $1 million prizes, but nothing ever came out of them. So they were something that was really a craze and dove down, and now you can't find a hackathon at all here. They're dead. So each one of these is kind of an experiment that runs. We are in the middle of an incubator accelerator experiment now that's on its way out for the most part. I'll tell you about that. But startups have their own needs. So as you're starting up, you have an inexperienced team that doesn't necessarily know what they're doing. Once you get to a scale up, you're starting to get a team and maybe you have some experience. And then after scale up, you've made the transformation into a team and you've got a network. So each of these at different points in time needs different capabilities in order to continue to grow as entrepreneurs. So these tools are out there, meetups and incubators for startups, accelerators, grants and funding for aspiring scale-ups, co-working and mentoring spaces for larger stars, but mentoring is the theme. So that is one key component that you'll see all the way along. I'm riffing. You let me go, I will go for an hour like this. So is anybody want to stop me or ask any questions along the way? Or should I just sort of continue at 80 miles an hour?
Can I ask a question, Rick, just briefly?
Of course, please.
I just wondered how much do you get into the mindset and how they look after themselves as individuals? Because it's a pretty brutal process, right? The sort of the psychology a startup and so forth, as well as how they work with each other. I've got a number of friends who've done it, and some have done brilliantly, and some have had some pretty bad consequences from the process, not just financially. Do you get into that on these sort of programs?
Sure, absolutely. So there's kind of two outcomes. One are mindset, and the other is tools. So if we've been successful, we give them the attitude that says, I can do this. And to be able to turn on, I'll show you some exercises that I use exactly for that at the beginning of each class. And then for the most part, then I'll start to go through the tools. But it's that's super critical in terms of what we're doing. And hold that thought too, because in about 5 slides, I have a little discussion on it. But thank you. Any other questions? I'll do this. I'll go for like 5 minutes and then I'll stop and I'll ask and we'll pause. But a lot of things to go through. Okay, so first off, when starting to teach entrepreneurship, it could be a subject that can go all over the place, and it's really helpful to have a framework to hang on to. And I'll show you my primary framework, and then we'll build lessons around that. So the framework that I use is often called the Steve Blank framework or the Steve Blank methodology. I was in a session today where people were talking about Alex Osterwalder. He's part of that same club, Business Canvas. So anytime you hear lean startup, lean anything, agile engineering, business model canvas, it's all the same sort of club that gets together and is I consider to be the stalwarts of entrepreneurial education. The 2 books that are typically most noted are the Startup Owner's Manual, which is written by Steve Blank. It's impossible to read. It's like a giant encyclopedia, and it goes step by step. And I'll show you those steps. I'll actually give you a quick lesson on that. And then for those that don't necessarily want to read an encyclopedia, the Lean Startup pulls out some of those principles and talks in generalities about how to go ahead and build a startup. Startup Owner Manual is circa 2005 and 6. Lean Startup is circa 2010. So these are fairly dated, but they've been true and have survived the test of time. Whole idea here is that building a startup can be based on the scientific method. So with the scientific method, you have a hypothesis about a problem that needs to be solved or a hypothesis about a solution that needs to be built. And we're teaching our students how to apply the scientific method to entrepreneurship, how to build a startup, how to develop experiments, to test their hypotheses, to develop, either prove or disprove their individual hypotheses, and then to move on. So it's not a classroom exercise. You learn from customers, you get out of the building, you speak with your customers about what they need, and if you build it, they will come. So that methodology looks like this. It's often called the 4 steps. First of the steps is problem solution. So you identify a problem that you hypothesize on a problem that you believe is worth solving. So you then develop a whole series of experiments to try to go off in the field, speak with your customers, get an idea as to whether they actually have that problem or not. If so, how are they solving it now? If they're solving it, what are they paying for that solution? Are they happy with that solution? Or is there better ways at which we can solve that same problem? And if there are, you develop a solution around that. So this whole idea of customer discovery is not necessarily developing something that you believe needs to be solved, but actually working with customers to try to suss that out. And to do that, you run a series of experiments, and we build low-level, simple prototypes called minimum viable products that you put in customers' hands. And after you've spoken with customers, and we have our students speak often with 50 to 100 individual customers, you try to find a product that's worth building. Now, this is something that's run on a fairly small database. 50 to 100 customers is not very many, but can this thing that you've now developed be mass market? So the next step is to try to take your problem and to figure out how to bring it to market. Bringing something to market is to identify what are your marketing messages? How do you reach your customers? What's your pricing strategy? What's your initial business model? All the kinds of things that now take something that's local and try to make it more global if you can. And along that way, develop a repeatable and sustainable sales process. So you're not selling one, you're selling many. You've got a formula that says if I spend X dollars on marketing and sales, I will have Y dollars that spit out. It's scalable, it's repeatable, it's sustainable. Great. Now I've got a sales process. At this point in time, I have a business model and I'm eligible for venture funding. Up to this point, I've been running through the entrepreneurial fog. I didn't know what problem I was solving. I didn't know what solution I had until I ran my experiments. I didn't know how I was going to take my product to market until I ran my experiments. Now that I have a repeatable, scalable sales process, I can start to build customers. I can raise money. Venture capitalists feel more secure that anything raised can then result in actual sales. So I take that business model, pump it out, and I prepare the company for rapid and scalable growth. Once I'm in this mode, then the fog has lifted. I'm out of the entrepreneurship fog. I've quit running experiments, and now I'm building a company, and there becomes a cultural change, a shift from searching into execution. So those 4 steps. So in an entrepreneurial environment, a classroom environment, we typically teach up to this stage. So we're teaching all of these methods, and then in an accelerator, something post-educational, then we work with companies on this side of it here. Okay, so those are the books. This was the original version. That's the Startup Owner's Manual. I highly suggest you buy it. It's like $20 or something. It's maybe 400 pages, and it's a worthwhile addition to any entrepreneurial library. So we do this whole experiential learning section at the front end. We develop sort of company-specific or solution-specific marketing and sales, and we bring in mentorship as a component. And then later on, post classroom, we deal with a formal structure, advisory boards, more mentorship, things along those lines. So that divides things up into its various stages. I'm going to stop here. Any questions? Cool.
Rick, yes, James van der Westhuizen here from Johannesburg in South Africa.
Yeah,
Quite interested in how this might change in a environment which is not kind of the traditional founder-driven, capital-rich startup environment like Silicon Valley. If we look at Africa, for example, where a startup can start from a much lower base, capital is much more difficult to find. How would you tweak this process for that kind of environment?
Yeah. So the process, I'm giving you the high level, highly accelerated process. The same exact series of steps would work across the board. And I do teach this in other countries and developing economies, actually in high school and other places. You simply tone them down. And the emphasis is less maybe on this section of it, which is the whole funding process and company building. But all of these steps here early on are exactly the same no matter where you go. So,
Hi, Rick. Sorry.
Yeah, hi.
I apologize. I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, please. You had a question?
My question was, is there a prerequisite to be a part of your course, a certain degree, et cetera, or do you have to be part of something larger? And
No, that's a great question. So the courses that are done in most schools for entrepreneurship, like this one, have no prerequisites whatsoever. So even though I may teach out of the College of Engineering and another place out of the business school, you don't have to have an engineering background or education. In fact, the best teams, and I'll talk about team formation in a minute, are diverse teams that have maybe an engineer, a business person, somebody from the humanities. In fact, my classes are about 1/3 each, about 1/3 engineers, 1/3 business majors, and 1/3 social sciences. people across the board, and they're often the most creative and have the best connections to real world problems.
Hey, Rick, I imagine when you're teaching this, the guys that are coming actually have a real sort of idea they're working on. It's not, okay. So, because that was my question was going to be, how do they let go of their original idea as they learn?
This is a great question. So hold that thought, because I'll show you an example of actually where we throw out their real ideas and then we make everybody start from scratch.
Okay.
So
All right.
Rick, just a question for you. Can you go back to that slide? The crossover to company building with advisory boards and formal structure.
Yeah.
Do you spend much time on that? Because that's a challenge we see that really frustrates, especially private equity, where they see a really good idea, a really good customer market fit, but there hasn't been enough attention put on the governance, and that leads to difficulties in funding or potential friction and tension between the entrepreneur and the investor.
Yeah, I'd say this is this is a full-on classroom environment. This is when you start to get involved with, oops, I'm sorry, there's my accelerator slide. Started involved in accelerators and sort of make the transition. This is typically done outside the classroom.
Okay.
You might be able to give people specific lessons and guidance. Like there's a lot of books about how to run a board, and how to do corporate governance and so on. But I'd say this is a ripe field for a lot of consulting work and things along those lines, and more discipline on how it's done.
Yeah, because most entrepreneurs roll their eyes when you bring up governance and better boards. It's just they look at it as a brake on their Ferrari.
It's called cultural change for a reason here.
Yeah.
And in the Steve Blank book, what he talks about are people that go all the way through this process that are individuals that are used to uncertainty and like the thrill of trying to solve problems. But then as soon as the problem is solved, they're bored stiff and they decide to move on, and somebody else, a professional management, starts to take over. That's me. I love this stuff. I get bored over here. So my mean time between failures is about 18 months in my career, and I move on intentionally. But there is a need for formal structure here and how to teach these individuals how to both transition early stage entrepreneurs into something that's more formal and to set up formal procedures and structures and so on, as well as those that run it.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so there are things out there. You hear the term incubators and accelerators. So incubators typically are government entities. They have no business model. Incubators don't make money. Somebody has to sponsor them, and these are the idea generators and so on. I often ask the question, how many incubators do you think there are in Silicon Valley? As a guess. Even order of magnitude. Give me a number, somebody. 500. 500. I often hear 500. 500 is a good number. I often hear 1,000. Sometimes one person say 10,000 in Silicon Valley. I don't know if we can even do that. The answer is 0. There are no incubators, formal incubators in Silicon Valley. Again, there's no business model. There's no government support for startups. There's a little bit of work going on in universities, but they're not formal incubators. They're more classroom environments. But in how many incubators are there in China? It's depending on how you count, it's either 5,000 or 10,000.
Yeah.
So there's 5,000 formal incubators and 5,000 maker spaces. And that number is about a year old. So I think there may be more than that now. Government support, they like to see early stage development. It's a bit more of a formal top-down process. So everything we do here is organically grown. It's entrepreneur fed. It's out of the garages. It's out of the coffee shops. Whatever we teach here is done typically out of universities and classrooms. Accelerators, we do have accelerators here. Those are focused on marketing and sales. They're focused on, they do have business models. I have a whole course on business models for accelerators, but it features either a venture capital model or some combination of co-working space, or maybe corporate innovation, where it's a linkage between startups and corporations who are willing to pay the bills. So that stuff does exist. So again, that's why here mostly this stuff is in the classroom, and this stuff here in the middle is mostly accelerators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about experiential learning. I won't, in the interest of time, this is going faster than I thought, so I will not go through this. Let me dive down into courses. UC Berkeley, go Bears, that's our library. And here's what I teach. So I currently teach these 4 courses in the classroom: innovation, advanced entrepreneurship, technology entrepreneurship, and a course called Disrupt Berkeley, which is a challenge lab. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think it's super interesting. And then all of these others I will touch on as well, because these are individual. You can say 3-day, 10-day, 15, 10-day, 10-day. So you can do this entire set of mindset and tools in a shorter period of time than a full semester. There's Berkeley. That's my office right there in the stadium. Where is that? Right there. So we teach the Berkeley method of entrepreneurship. There's something called Challenge Labs, Industry Colliders, and there's something called the Berkeley Innovation Index that I'll introduce you guys to, which is kind of cool to take. Colliders are the ability to teach across courses at various levels, to do experiential learning, to involve outsiders, and then to actually spin them out. So this is that same process. This is the Berkeley version of that same thing that I just showed you earlier. Challenge Labs. I'm going to skip a couple things. All right, let me get into the meat of it. Entrepreneurship is not a linear journey. Entrepreneurship looks like this. It's an ugly mess. And so what we try to do is to give students the mindset to prepare for this. In the real world, in math and science and chemistry and literature and everything else, they're taught this methodology, but they aren't necessarily taught how to deal with adversity and setbacks, especially in a team-based environment where there's a lot of contention and difficulties. So the teaching methodology is kind of twofold. One is this idea of progress on technology and our product. These are the tools that we provide. And you can see, you can learn the tools pretty fast. That's why we have 3-day courses and 10-day courses, and you can get there. But it's this whole social progress on developing a stakeholder ecosystem and a team that works well that takes a lot longer. So what we try to do is to basically prime this and to give people the sensitivity about how to deal with adversity and setbacks, and pull them together and try to, within a period of time, to develop both elements, mindset and off we go. These are the formal elements that I use. Berkeley method of entrepreneurship, which I'll show you in a minute. Naeem Zafar did this thing called GATES, which I'll show you in a minute. We have a formal playbook structure, and I use Steve Blank as the underlying framework. So we're trying to develop a mindset. We use modern concepts and tools. And I also introduced the idea of mission-based cultures. So it's not all profit-based. These same tools and implementations can be used for not-for-profits. They can be used for charitable organizations. They can be used for governments. They can be used for anything that has a mission. In companies, the mission might be profit, but in other cases, like the military, it might be to protect the country. In the post office, it might be to deliver mail on time. It's not profit-based, it's mission-based. All this stuff, the tools apply across the board, which makes them pretty interesting. Okay, start. First thing we do, we start a classroom, we form teams. So my typical classroom size, I can teach as, I just taught a class of 10, but a typical one is between 40 and 60. I've taught as many as 500. So the idea is we try to get them to center on a problem to solve. Question came up earlier, do we let them start with an initial problem? No. If somebody has a startup that they're working on, or has an idea that they have developed in any way, shape, or form, have put in any work into it, we throw it out. The idea is everybody starts from day one with a blank sheet of paper, and the team gets together. We put together diverse teams. Teams of 4 to 5 in this environment are ideal. Less than that, it's a lot of pressure. They're not able to share work and not able to get a teamwork sort of esprit de corps. More than that, you get freeloader effect. Around 5, you start to get somebody that is freeloading a little bit. 6, you always get a freeloader. 7, you always get 2 freeloaders. So between 4 and 5 seems to work effectively in this environment. I interview them and I approve the teams, and they have to be diverse. They always have to have diverse gender. Can't be all guys or all girls. Have to have diverse majors. So I want engineers and business people and the humanities. Have to be diverse in terms of seniority. So freshmen and seniors are getting together. And this diversity gives you diversity of thought, diversity of skills. And they can't have worked on a project together. So no two people can have worked together before. So everybody's starting from scratch.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is your definition of a freeloader just someone not contributing?
Yeah, basically. So it's a team. These are team projects. I'll show you the grading scheme in a minute. There are team grades that are there, and you know, if 3 or 4 people are putting in a lot of work and the 5th is not, that's a problem for everybody, and that creates contention amongst the team. I mean, which is okay, but you have to manage it. And lastly, that person does not deserve the grade that everybody else has as well. So freeloaders are bad.
I wondered if freeloaders weren't typed correctly. Like maybe they felt left out because they didn't have a proper typing or something.
Oh, yeah. That happens. So if you get a team of 4 or 5 that never met each other, and you're putting them together for the first time, sometimes you get somebody that's ostracized and pushed out, and we monitor that. I'll show you how we do that in a little bit. A very good question. The social aspect of it is super important. I bring in mentors to do that. This is just the mentors from the last classroom I had. Mentors are senior people that either volunteer their time or paid a small stipend. Gloria runs trade for the local Brazilian consulate. Mark has built half a dozen startups himself. I've known him for 20 years. Elizabeth runs a foundation. She's an actress as well. I just saw her in a few films over the weekend. So people with experience in diverse backgrounds. It's pretty fun. Here's a class. So here's my 15-week class. It starts off with mindset and team formation. So we form teams straight away. Okay. We then teach them how to do problem, solution, and customer discovery. Customer discovery is teaching them how to interview. They have to go out in the field. They have to speak with real customers, potential customers. We teach them how to do a persona. They interview between 50 and 100 potential customers. So everything they're doing typically is a B2C problem. We teach them about customer value proposition and problem solution fit, and then they present. So we stop the classroom and we say, oh, here's a checkpoint. Give us a presentation on the problem that you found and the solution that you're going to propose. And at this point, that's 4 weeks. That's not a lot of time. And they have to have done customer interviews and show us basically the overall group of evidence that they've compiled in order to prove their hypothesis. And at this point in time, we can do mid-course corrections. So if their problem isn't worth solving or the solution is clunky or whatever, we can go ahead and make mid-course corrections. I'll talk about this in a minute. Oh, so mindset. You know, during this period, usually the second week, we do mindset games. Not everybody, especially in multiple cultures. So I teach a lot of Asian cultures, Chinese, Korean, Japanese. They're not used to going off and interviewing strangers and speaking with people. So students in general tend to be shy, but some cultures are extremely shy. So we have 2 games, and I'll show these slides, and there's links to those games about how to get students out there and out of their comfort zone. First one's rejection therapy. Students are required to go off and ask somebody a question, or ask for, a favor where the answer is expected to be no. So they'll ask somebody out on a date, or they'll ask for, change for $100, or they'll ask for a ride to go somewhere for a perfect stranger. And this rejection therapy, we force them to ask each individual at least 3 situations where they may get the answer no. They have to film it, and then they turn that film in as their videos in as their homework assignment. It's pretty funny. And they feel empowered. They now can approach somebody, and their team members are encouraging them and getting them on. They're empowered to be able to go off and ask strangers. And so when they do interviews, they feel more comfortable. Trade up game you may have heard of, that's taking something useless. The prototypical one is a red paperclip. They have to take this useless item as a team and trade. Hello, stranger, will you trade my red paperclip for something else of value? What else do you have? They go through and they find a pen. Okay. Hi, stranger, will you take my pen and trade it up for something of value? And they get a binder, and it goes up and up and up. The video that's featured here has somebody that did 14 trades and got it from a red paperclip to a house. People have come back with animals, like a cat. Somebody came back with $100 worth of merchandise. So it's fun, and it gives them kind of the mindset to be adventurous, and they're super quick and they're super effective.
How are you doing that in an online environment?
Ooh, good. Basically the same. I say go off, and they can still go to a store with a mask. It's not 100% online, so they do have to get out of their home and to be able to do at least something. They're not as effective, but it does work still. And the other thing we do is I have a class now that is how to find and interview people in an online environment. And so there's a whole way in which you'd reach out to potential customers and speak to them through online groups, through social media, things like that. So it can be done. Good question. Okay, so they've interviewed, they've got their mindset kind of straightened out. They've now got a problem solution, and then we start to work on the next phase. Give them all the tools in marketing and sales, marketing strategy, key metrics, business models, revenue models, distribution, channels, partnerships. And then they have to come back with gate 2. Gate 2 is a presentation on problems, on product market fit. How are you going to take your solution, and how are you going to actually provide it to the market? Then we start to work with them on all the financial modeling, to teach them about business models. And then gate 3 is the actual business model presentation with financials. We teach them about VC and equity. And then finally, there's a final, which is presenting their plan in front of investors. So get the idea. It mirrors the Steve Blank methodology directly. Gate 1, stop, check in, problem solution. Gate 2, business models and go to market. Gate 3, financials, and then finally a full investor pitch. The investor pitch is exactly that. It is a full-on investor pitch, and it is given to investors. I'll show you investors in a minute. Yep. Questions on that? I mentioned it can be done in non-profit oriented environments. I taught a class about how to disrupt Berkeley. This was students did not go off and solve separate problems. Rather, they came back to university administrators, and they were doing things like the admissions process, food, counseling, housing, all kinds of things that were student-oriented problems that were nonprofit oriented. And so We disrupted Berkeley. They had real projects that they implemented, but this had the same sort of thing. So we went through interviews and goals and identifying impact, which had a gate one. I had 3 large teams that did student transfers and advisory work, dining hall issues, and professor evaluations. We had KPIs that they had to show and deliver, where they came in with their project plans and their budgets, and they gave final presentations to university administrators, and all 3 projects were accepted by the university and are now being part of the overall university administration system, which is kind of cool. So gates, problem to solve, KPIs, and a project plan. I'm going to go pretty fast because I got 10 minutes left. Quizzes, we do quizzes every single project. And here's our final project. For a final project, I have students put together an entire adventure presentation. So it is typically 20 minutes in duration. It's judged by venture capitalists. These are my venture capitalists. Each of these people either runs a firm. Paul Holoman is responsible for business development at Disney. Clint Chow runs a large venture firm. Lisa Podesnak is responsible for Coastal Ventures. She's a CFO of Coastal Ventures. So I'm lucky to have all these people that come in, and their final grade is solely based on how well they're able to convince these judges that they have a good project. So we use this as the fear factor and scare our students to death about, you know, these mean judges. They're actually very nice people, but it's pretty effective. Yeah, this final project.
Rick, how often would they invest in them?
Never. Not initially. These are student projects. Remember the cycle that I showed you about, you know, the first thing about customer discovery, customer validation, and then movement over towards the transition to company growth. So there I say never.
Stage, I mean, eventually when they've gone through, do they track them and, you know, come back?
Yeah. So first off, these projects are never measured on whether somebody invests in them or not.
Yeah.
You know, they're basically measured by some criteria that we give the judges as to whether they've gathered proper evidence and their story is believable.
Yeah.
Then after class, you know, if there's 4 or 5 students, it's very rare that many projects do continue. I'd say probably about, depending on the class, between 10 and 20% of the project actually continue on to something. The team almost never stays together as an entire team. So maybe 1, 2, or 3 of those people that really got along famously, minus the freeloaders, will get together and to continue on. They'll typically join an accelerator and to start to work on, you know, all the actual details of marketing and sales plans, and to finishing off the prototypes and getting it ready for market. So maybe 6 months to a year later, they'll have something that's launchable. And then at that point in time, they'll seek funding. And so out of the 10 to 20% that succeed, probably, I'm going to say on average, 1 per class becomes a company. I don't even know what those numbers are. I think it's super dangerous to measure that. And that's one of the problems with accelerators, is incubators especially, they measure it so tightly that the poor people aren't able to be really free to go off and find their own destiny. And that's kind of the essence of entrepreneurship. It's one of the problems with corporate innovation too. If you think about corporate innovation, you have these poor startup people that are under a lens to perform, and corporations are under a quarterly metric to get going and have these people that they invested in do something.
Yep.
Well, you know, startups don't work that way. You can't measure them on a quarterly basis, and you can't figure out how well they're going to perform, because they're going to take their own journey and take their own time. And most corporations don't have the patience for that. So that's one of the points of friction. We do grade things. So this is the grading scheme. In this one class, it was majority of team grades. Each of the gates is graded, and then the final is graded. And then they have, typical things. That's why I do quizzes, because I have to grade them individually, and then comments on class, and I do have them do blogs, all kinds of other things. So we have to come up with some modality. 5 minutes left, so let me just plow through. So I've shown you my agenda. So there's a couple other things. If you wanted to get this in a can, this company I would highly recommend taking a look at, Exec. So they teach this roughly same methodology. They have this all built up. It's used by 100 universities. So if somebody's not developing their own curriculum, they can use somebody else's. You can buy this off the shelf. It is $99 per student. Students pay that like they would pay for a textbook. And it's super, super interesting. I really like these guys. And I've helped develop some of their curriculum as well. So endorsement, thumbs up. There's another methodology, different than the Steve Blank methodology. This is a very nice book written through MIT, Bill Ollett, called Disciplined Entrepreneurship. It starts off with not a problem to solve, which is not really human nature. Human nature is I have a thing that I've built and I want to now build a company around it, or I have an idea, or I have a passion, I love something, or I hate something. And so that's not a problem to solve per se. So this is a methodology to take one of those, and it's more detailed, to segment the market, to establish a beachhead market. What are you going to do first? Who is going to buy this thing? How big is the market? So it goes at it from a slightly different way. It's another method of teaching I quite like, but just know that it's out there. And then it breaks down all these individual steps, and you can see that it's quite similar at the highest level to what we do in the others, but it's all good. And then the idea is to take a thing and to be very specific about how you go to market overall. And then my last one. So this is the 3-week program. This is the 500 student program that typically is run in Portugal. We do 3 a year in Doha, in Portugal, and then some other location. Most recently, we did Shenzhen, China. And it is the same program that's divided up into 15 individual days. With 500 students, we have 100 teams of 5. I'm head of mentors. We have 100 mentors, and we crank through. This is real, it's factory-oriented entrepreneurship. A typical day will be all keynotes in the morning, and then just experiential working on your development all afternoon. And then they have individual gates, and there are tons of mentors. Chief mentors, marketing mentors, design mentors, life coaches. Students are away from home for the first time. They're getting boyfriend-girlfriend fights. They have team fights. They have life issues. So we have life coaches, which is kind of interesting. Hardware, software mentors, and then the others. So this whole component of either volunteers or other people that are experienced who want to give back, it's a huge component for all these entrepreneurship programs. There's a methodology called Digital Promise, which is challenge-based learning. This is a newer online thing sponsored by the US Department of Education. I'm now learning this, so I'm starting my own course in the Digital Promise frankly, this week, and off we go. Here's a little bit on mentorship. Mentors, you have to train your mentors. You can't bring in people from scratch. They don't know how to do this. A lot of people, especially engineers, want to do things for students. That's bad. So you have to teach, don't tell. You have to just challenge assumptions. There's a whole methodology to mentorship. So as head of mentors, I have to teach 100 mentors how to mentor and be chief of their domain, and how to do stand-ups, and how to do group work, and how to set their own individual mentorship style, and how to construct pivots, and how to settle fights, because there's a lot of fights that go on. It's fun. And then students, and I'm going to end here. There's a bunch more. I'm going to send you guys all the slides. Students love to do student things. That's their little universe. They want to be social, they want to eat, and they want to travel. And so all the problems they come up with, there's a pattern. They all want to meet their friends at a bar, or they all want to find a sports team to join. I will not let them run these projects. So in the process of forming teams, we form teams around diversity, and we form projects that are not student oriented. They have to get out of their comfort zone and try to find other problems to go off and solve. So we're straight up at the hour. Sorry for that. There was too much stuff here.
Rick, how do you, fantastic. I mean, tour de force. How do you, this is a genuine question, how do you stay fresh? I know you're in this space, like immersed in it, but some faculty, you're the exception. Some faculty I've come across, I won't mention names, they're great people, but they're not up to date with what's really happening. So some of the people I know in strategy, innovation, leadership, they're great people, but what they describe as reality is about often 1, 2, 5, sometimes 10 years out of date. How do you stay fresh?
Well, I'm lucky I live here, Silicon Valley. So
Okay.
yeah,
That's the silly
that's
question.
part of it. I really so this is entrepreneurship. This is this is the front line. And I use the metaphor again of throwing students in the deep end of the pool and teaching them how to swim. So I'm watching them flounder, and there's no ideal way to do that. So I'm trying to continually invent new things, new tricks, new tools. I'm always doing research. Every single class is written again from scratch. Drives me crazy. And
Wow.
Yeah. So I retool everything every semester. There's a group of us that teach this way. I'm fortunate enough to be at a couple schools where everybody's crazy like me, which is fun.
Is that sorry? I'm conscious over time. That retooling every semester, that's phenomenal. Is that your passion for doing it in an amazing way? Is it because things are changing so fast? Is it a bit of both, or what?
A little bit of both. So some of it is, I wish I had taught that a little differently. Oh, my students didn't quite get that, and I could do better. And because this is new, there's no patterns to follow. There's other than my friends who do the same thing. So you kind of have to invent as you go.
Good for you.
So that's kind of cool.
I
I'm
have-
also in places that give us total freedom. So in most universities, in order to teach, you have to have a PhD. Have a PhD, you have to be basically an academic or a researcher.
Yes.
I'm neither. I don't have a PhD. I have 4 degrees, but none of this is at that level.
Yeah.
And so I'm a practitioner. And I think if you find a university that doesn't let entrepreneurs teach entrepreneurship, they're going to be these guys that are around there with stuff that's 5-10 years old, or they're still teaching Alfred Sloan, or Henry Ford for entrepreneurship. So yeah, it's important to stay current.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
As this is thank you so much for your presentation. As this is a program, a certification, do you foresee any type of, and typically I would assume, many different levels go into it, but if someone was in business, a BS or BA, do you foresee that this will eventually go into something like a bachelor's degree,
Sure.
entrepreneurial? This currently is not, correct?
There are, well, I focus mostly on Berkeley, which does not have an entrepreneurship degree. So the terminal degree is either business degree or engineering degree, something like that. And so entrepreneurship is a portion of that. We teach them the mindset and tools for a semester or 2 and let them go. I also teach in Northeastern, which does have an entrepreneurship degree. And what I'm showing you here then is only the experiential learning part of the course. And there's a startup course and a scale-up course there. I teach both. And it's surrounded by more classical learning about innovation. So they'll learn about Peter Drucker and Clayton Christensen and Rita McGrath. And I actually brought Chris into one of my classes, and we ran a simulation last semester just to try it out. So it can either, this doesn't have to be a 4-year degree. I actually don't believe in 4-year degrees for entrepreneurship. Why would you go to school for 4 years to learn how to do a startup? Why not just learn it for a semester or 2 and then go do your damn startup? And then all the other stuff about, if you're doing an engineering oriented startup, yeah, you have to be trained as an engineer. Or if you're you're doing something where you want to focus on the finance stuff, yeah, you can spend 4 years and worry about finance, accounting and finance and everything else. That's all good. But the entrepreneurship component is just that mindset and tools that allow you to take those broader skills and to target them at something that's a brand new company. Or, and by the way, all these same things work within a larger organization where you want to be the entrepreneur within an innovation group at a large corporation. The same tools apply.
And thank you. And would the same registration apply as being a student with the university, or how does one get in touch with your next dated course?
I can give you a schedule. Though, thank you for asking. I can give you a schedule for what's going on. I largely teach at universities where you have to be admitted, and you're part of a you're matriculating towards a degree. But there are individual courses taught by myself or others, it doesn't have to be me, that are out there. The one that's probably the most accessible is that European Innovation Academy. So if you take a look at inacademy.eu, and they're forming, because of COVID, they're forming what their programs will look like this year. But it looks like they're going to do Portugal again, which might be smaller, maybe only 250 students. That will be in July.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. What's the agenda? Are we the last course of the day?
Hi everyone. So I think we're a bit over time, and the main room is waiting for us to get back.
Okay.
It's there's been a lot of good questions, and it's been a great session, Rick.
Thanks.
I'm going to send over the link to the main room if you would like to join. It's the closing. Chris will be running it, and also social hour. So more time for more questions and hanging out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank
You
Rick.
find the link in your chat.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. Fantastic.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Wonderful.